Rachel Carter had never been the kind of woman who rushed into things, yet when she signed the papers for the pale brick house on Hawthorne Lane, she felt a surge of reckless joy that was almost frightening. For years, she had lived in apartments with thin walls and shared laundry rooms, always promising herself that one day she would build a space entirely her own, a place that bore the marks of her vision and her effort. As an architect, she was used to working on blueprints for other people, turning clients' demands into livable structures, but she longed for something that was hers alone, something that could carry both her professional pride and her personal sense of freedom. The backyard, wide and enclosed by mature oaks, had been the reason she chose the property. It was a blank canvas, but when she first stepped onto it, she already saw what it could become: a tranquil retreat with clean lines, a modern pool at its center, and enough room for gatherings that would never feel cramped or intrusive. She spent weeks sketching ideas, calculating costs, and negotiating with contractors until the design became reality. And the moment she saw the finished pool glittering under the afternoon sun, she felt that rare satisfaction of a dream materializing, without compromise. Her first evenings in the house were quiet in the way that only new beginnings can be. A silence filled with the sound of water lapping against tile and the distant hum of cicadas. She would sit on the edge of the deck with a glass of wine, dipping her feet into the cool water, imagining all the summers ahead. To Rachel, the pool was more than a luxury. It was a statement that she had built something lasting for herself. Not borrowed, not rented, but earned through years of late nights at the drafting table and compromises she had endured in a profession dominated by louder, older voices. The house, the yard, and especially the pool symbolized independence, and she guarded that feeling carefully, almost superstitiously, as if acknowledging how precious it was might cause it to vanish. She believed she had finally found a neighborhood where she could breathe freely, where the slow rhythm of suburban life would leave her undisturbed. But the suburbs are rarely as quiet as they appear, and in every row of similar houses there is always one figure who resists change, who treats the street as their own domain, and the neighbors as tenants under an invisible rule. For Hawthorne Lane, that figure was Karen Miller, a widow in her 60s whose lawn was immaculate, whose roses bloomed with suspicious perfection, and whose presence lingered in every whispered conversation among the residents. Rachel had noticed her only briefly at first, a slim woman with perfectly brushed hair and a measured smile that seemed stretched too tight, the kind of person who offered greetings that sounded like warnings. On the second evening after Rachel moved in, she saw Karen standing at the corner of her yard, hands clasped behind her back, looking over the new pool as if it were an intruder. Karen did not wave. She simply nodded once before walking away, and Rachel told herself it was nothing more than neighborly curiosity, though the glance stayed with her longer than she expected. When Karen finally approached, it was not with the polite formality Rachel might have anticipated. She appeared at the fence late one afternoon, her voice carrying easily as she remarked that pools were a nuisance to maintain, and often became swamps if you weren't diligent. Rachel, caught off guard, responded with professional confidence, explaining that she had designed the drainage system herself, that everything was planned and precise, but Karen only smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no warmth. Their brief exchange ended without open hostility, yet Rachel sensed a thread of judgment woven into every word. It was as though Karen considered herself the guardian of neighborhood standards, and the new arrival with her modern ideas had already trespassed against some unspoken code. That evening, as Rachel floated alone in the quiet blue water, she caught herself replaying the conversation, wondering why the approval of a stranger mattered to her at all. She shook the thought away, reminding herself that the house was hers, the pool was hers, and no one could take that from her. What she did not yet understand was how fiercely some people fight against what they cannot control, and how quickly a dream can turn into a battleground once envy and resentment begin to fester. The first real crack in the calm surface of Rachel's new life came on a morning that seemed, at first, like any other. She stepped outside with her coffee, the steam curling upward into the already warming air, and she felt the small swell of pride that still accompanied every glance at her backyard. The pool reflected the sky with a glassy stillness that made her believe the world was under control, that her careful planning had secured not just a home, but a sanctuary. She walked closer, intending to dip her hand into the water, but stopped abruptly when she noticed the faint discoloration near the deep end. At first, she thought it was nothing more than fallen leaves or pollen, but as she leaned forward, she saw floating scraps of paper, greasy food wrappers, and a half-crushed soda can drifting slowly along the surface. The water, which had been perfectly clean the evening before, now carried the unmistakable stench of rotting vegetables, and when she reached with the net, she pulled out a soggy plastic bag stuffed with discarded takeout containers. Her stomach tightened with confusion before giving way to anger, and the sharpness of that anger unsettled her, because it was not directed at the faceless concept of someone, but at a very specific image, Karen Miller's carefully powdered face, peering from her kitchen window. Rachel told herself not to jump to conclusions, not to assign blame without proof, yet the thought returned again and again as she spent the next hour fishing out debris, rinsing the filters and adding extra chlorine to fight the contamination. The idea that this could have been an accident seemed laughable. The volume of trash was too much for a gust of wind to explain, and the placement suggested deliberate intent. When she found a crumpled paper bag with the printed address of a nearby grocery store and Karen's name scribbled on the side in black marker, the matter of proof ceased to be ambiguous. It was as if the act had been both vandalism and a message, an unspoken declaration of hostility delivered in the most humiliating way possible. That evening, Rachel walked across the lawn, rehearsing the words she would use, determined to remain calm and rational. But when she reached Karen's porch, the woman opened the door before she could even knock. The smile Karen wore was so wide it was grotesque, a display that made Rachel's practiced composure falter. She held up the bag and asked directly, "This ended up in my pool. Do you know how that could have happened?" Karen glanced at the soggy paper without surprise, then shrugged lightly and said, "The wind does strange things around here." You'll learn that soon enough. Her voice carried no trace of apology, no recognition of how absurd the excuse sounded, only a vague amusement that made Rachel feel like a child being chastised for asking a foolish question. When Rachel pressed further, pointing out the sheer amount of trash, Karen's eyes hardened, and she leaned against the doorframe with the slow confidence of someone who knew she held the upper hand. "Maybe you should think about what kind of yard you're keeping," she said. "A pool is like a magnet for problems. Animals, pests, debris. People don't like seeing it either. It changes the character of the neighborhood. Perhaps you'll consider that." And with that, she shut the door, leaving Rachel stunned at the bluntness of the dismissal. The incident should have been minor, nothing more than a petty annoyance to be handled and forgotten, yet it lingered in Rachel's mind like a thorn that refused to dislodge. She found herself staring out the window at odd hours, scanning the yard for movement, noticing that Karen often stood at the edge of her property, watching silently before retreating as soon as Rachel caught sight of her. A tension grew that stretched beyond the pool itself, saturating the air with a quiet hostility that no one else acknowledged. Other neighbors waved politely, chatted briefly about gardening or school schedules, but there was always a subtle pause in their voices when Rachel mentioned Karen's name, a flicker in their eyes that told her they knew something she did not. The next strike came less than a week later. Rachel returned from a long day at the office, her shoulders aching from hours hunched over blueprints, and as she pulled into her driveway, she saw that the recycling bins she had left neatly stacked were overturned, their contents spilled across the gravel like a deliberate display. Glass bottles lay shattered and bits of cardboard were scattered up to the fence. For a moment, she simply stood there, the engine still idling, the sinking realization dawning that this was no accident. She spent the next hour cleaning the mess while the sun sank behind the houses, every sound exaggerated in the twilight silence, the crunch of broken glass under her shoes, the rustle of paper bags carried by the breeze, and, once, the distinct sound of laughter coming faintly from Karen's backyard. Rachel did not look in that direction. She did not need to. The laughter was enough, sharp and mocking, puncturing the thin skin of patience she had tried to maintain. It was then she began to understand that she was not merely dealing with a difficult neighbor, but with a calculated campaign, a pattern of harassment intended to unsettle and erode her sense of belonging. What chilled her most was the thought that Karen had chosen her deliberately, that the pool was merely the trigger for something deeper, a desire to dominate, to remind every new resident that Hawthorne Lane was not theirs to claim. Rachel considered calling the police, but the idea seemed ridiculous. What would she say? That her neighbor might have thrown trash into her yard? That she had a bad feeling? She could imagine the thinly veiled smirk on the officer's face as he jotted down her complaint, already dismissing it as the trivial quarrel of suburban women with too much time. She considered approaching the homeowners association, but the thought of sitting in a sterile office while her grievances were reduced to paperwork filled her with dread. And so she did nothing, at least outwardly. She kept her voice level when she greeted Karen in passing. She smiled at neighbors who asked if she was settling in well, and she maintained the appearance of calm. But inside, a storm brewed. Each time she skimmed the pool, she imagined Karen watching from her window, savoring the humiliation. Each time she took the trash out, she half expected to find it overturned again, a ritual of degradation performed in silence. Nights grew restless. She would wake at the faintest creak, convinced she heard footsteps outside, and she began leaving the porch light on as if illumination alone could ward off malice. The sanctuary she had built, the dream she had carved from months of labor, no longer felt safe, and the bitterness of that betrayal was almost unbearable. What Rachel did not yet realize was that Karen had no intention of stopping, because for people like her, satisfaction is not found in a single act of cruelty, but in the sustained erosion of someone else's peace. The pool had become more than a structure of water and tile. It had become the battlefield on which Karen intended to prove that no one, not even a young professional with her designs and her confidence, could alter the balance of power that had defined the street for decades. The catalyst was not just the trash in the water or the laughter in the dark. It was the dawning awareness that Rachel's dream and Karen's resentment were on a collision course that neither could avoid. Rachel tried to convince herself that ignoring Karen would starve the conflict of oxygen, that if she simply continued living as if nothing had happened, the hostility would lose its momentum. Yet the uneasy calm lasted less than a week before the Shu-Chi, first true escalation, shattered any illusion of peace. It was a Saturday morning in late spring, sunlight pouring across the yard in golden sheets, the kind of morning that reminded Rachel why she had chosen this house and why she had endured months of negotiations with contractors to make the pool, exactly as she envisioned. She carried a basket of clean towels to the deck, planning to spend the afternoon working outdoors, but as she stepped closer, her stomach twisted. Someone had been in the yard. The gate, which she always kept locked, hung slightly ajar, the latch forced upward as though pried open with deliberate strength, and the evidence of intrusion lay scattered across the water. Not only trash this time, but shredded paper, splintered wood, and a deflated plastic ball bobbing along the ripples. Her eyes darted to the deck chairs, and there, unmistakably, was the damp outline of someone having sat with wet clothes. The realization that strangers, no, that Karen and whoever she brought with her, had entered her sanctuary without permission, filled her with a nauseating combination of fury and violation. She stormed to Karen's house, her pulse drumming with every step, and when the door opened, Karen stood with the same unnerving composure, as though she had been expecting this confrontation. Rachel demanded to know why the gate had been tampered with, why her pool had been used, and Karen tilted her head with that faint smile that was neither apology nor denial, but something colder. "It was just for a short while," she said, her voice light, almost playful. "My nieces were visiting, and the day was unbearably hot." You wouldn't begrudge children a little relief, would you? Rachel's mouth fell open at the audacity, at the way Karen spoke as if Rachel were the unreasonable one. She insisted that this was private property, that no one had the right to trespass. But Karen's smile only widened, her tone sharpening with quiet malice. You should remember that this neighborhood has a history. Lanes have shifted before. Fences are not the only things that change. Perhaps you ought to check whether that pool of yours even sits entirely on your lot. Rachel staggered back, as though struck. The suggestion was absurd. She had reviewed the survey when she purchased the property. She had double-checked every boundary before laying a single stone. But Karen's words were designed not to assert truth, but to plant doubt. And doubt took root, quickly when combined with fear. That night, Rachel sat at her desk, pulling out folders of documents, rereading the survey with a trembling finger tracing each line, reassuring herself that nothing had been misplaced, yet she could not shake the image of Karen leaning in the doorway with that sly suggestion. It was not about facts, Rachel realized. It was about control, about undermining her confidence until she questioned even what she knew. Over the following days, the pattern grew more insidious. Rachel noticed small changes each time she stepped outside. A patch of flowers near the fence trampled as though by deliberate footsteps, muddy streaks on the deck that did not match her own shoes, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air long after she had closed the windows. Once she found her mailbox left open, its contents scattered just enough to feel like a warning rather than a robbery. Each incident was minor in isolation, easily dismissed as coincidence or carelessness, but together they formed a tapestry of harassment too intricate to ignore. She considered speaking to other neighbors, but when she broached the subject cautiously at a block gathering, the shift in their expressions was immediate. Smiles stiffened, eyes darted away, and one older man muttered that Karen had her ways before changing the subject. It became clear that everyone knew, that everyone had suffered in small ways, but none dared to stand against her. The silence of the street was its own kind of betrayal, leaving Rachel more alone than she had ever felt in her life. One evening she heard voices near the fence, laughter drifting across the twilight, and when she peered out the window she saw Karen leaning with her elbows on the railing, speaking animatedly to a pair of neighbors. Her hands gestured toward Rachel's yard, and though Rachel could not make out the words, the tone was unmistakable. Conspiratorial, derisive, full of mockery. The neighbors nodded uncomfortably, their body language uncertain, but they did not walk away. Rachel's chest tightened with the realization that her reputation was being reshaped in whispers she could not defend herself against, that in the absence of resistance, Karen's version of events would solidify into fact. Soon she would not merely be a victim of harassment, but the neighborhood's cautionary tale, the outsider who disrupted harmony with her pride and her pool. The breaking point came on a humid night when Rachel was folding laundry in the living room and suddenly heard a splash from the backyard. Her body froze, her ears straining, and when the sound came again, she dropped the clothes and rushed to the window. There, illuminated by the dim glow of the deck lights, were two teenagers thrashing in the water, laughing loudly, while Karen sat comfortably in one of the lounge chairs, sipping from a glass as though she were the rightful host. Rage propelled Rachel outside, her voice sharp as she demanded they leave immediately, but Karen's response was infuriatingly calm. "Relax, Rachel," she said without even standing. "They're just children." "It's perfectly harmless," Rachel shouted that it was trespassing, that it was illegal, that she would call the police, and finally Karen rose, gathering her things with a sigh that carried the weight of false disappointment. "You'll regret being so unneighborly," she said softly, almost tenderly, before shepherding the teenagers out through the gate they had pried open once more. Rachel stood by the pool long after they left, her reflection trembling on the disturbed water, her hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. She had never felt so powerless, so stripped of agency in a place she had built for her own strength. It dawned on her then that this was no longer about irritation or even hostility. This was a campaign of possession, an attempt to rewrite ownership through sheer audacity, and if she did not act decisively soon, the neighborhood itself might come to believe that Karen was right, that the boundaries of the yard, of the pool, of Rachel's very place on Hawthorne Lane were not fixed but negotiable. The escalation was not simply in the acts of trespass or vandalism, but in the psychological siege, and Rachel knew with a cold certainty that what had begun as scattered trash had transformed into something far more dangerous. A battle for the legitimacy of her home. Rachel had always believed that control came from clarity, that if one gathered enough facts and stood firmly on the truth, chaos would eventually dissolve into order. Yet by the time summer pressed its heavy hand over Hawthorne Lane, she realized that her truth alone was insufficient armor against Karen's campaign of intrusion. The pool, once her pride, had become a contested space, not by any legal measure but through the insidious force of suggestion and the erosion of confidence, and Rachel knew that if she continued to meet harassment only with anger, she would collapse under the weight of it. So she made a choice, not impulsively but with the deliberate resolve of someone who had grown tired of fighting battles on an enemy's terms, and that choice was to strip the pool of the very power Karen used against her. She contacted a landscaping crew and ordered what sounded absurd even to her ears: truckloads of sand, smooth, white, and fine, delivered directly into her backyard. The foreman raised his eyebrows when she explained her plan, but she stood with arms folded, daring him to question her further, and by the end of the week the transformation began. Rachel watched as hoses pumped the water away, as the once gleaming surface drained into muddy channels. And though the sight pained her, she also felt a strange exhilaration, as if she were burning down her own fortress in order to build something stronger from the ashes. The men worked for days, wheelbarrows creaking under the weight of sand, shovels biting deep, until the basin was filled to the brim and compacted into a soft expanse that shimmered beneath the sun like the edge of an unseen ocean. She designed the layout herself, of course, sketching long into the night: low wooden platforms for lounge chairs, a fire pit encircled by stone, even a small pergola draped with fabric to cast gentle shade. Where once there had been water, now there was a private beach, sculpted not by nature but by Rachel's stubborn will. When it was finished, she invited no one, said nothing, but simply sat at the center of it one evening as dusk spread violet across the sky. The sand still smelled faintly of salt, the fire pit flickered with new flame, and the sound of the wind brushing across the surface was softer, less restless than the water had ever been. She realized that Karen could no longer define her sanctuary, because the pool had been the battlefield of Karen's choosing, and now that battlefield was gone. It was not defeat, but metamorphosis, a refusal to allow her identity to be trapped in a struggle she had not asked for. For a moment she felt untouchable, as though she had slipped from Karen's grasp entirely. But Karen was not the sort to surrender quietly. The very next morning, Rachel found her standing at the fence, staring at the new creation with an expression that mixed contempt with something closer to fear. "What is this supposed to be?" Karen asked, her voice carrying across the yard without invitation. Rachel did not answer. She simply adjusted one of the wooden chairs and continued with her work. The silence enraged Karen more than any words could have, and she barked, "This is ridiculous. You've ruined the neighborhood. Sand like that will clog the drains, spread into our lawns. It's a hazard." Rachel lifted her head slowly, her voice even but firm. "It's mine. And it's not going anywhere." She turned her back before Karen could reply, but she knew the woman well enough to sense the storm that was gathering. Within days, the letters began. Anonymous at first, slid under her door or left in her mailbox without signature, filled with phrases like reckless alteration and public nuisance, written in a handwriting so carefully disguised it was almost comical. Then came the official complaint from the Homeowners Association, citing concerns about unapproved modifications, and potential erosion risks. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, the document spread before her, and felt the familiar pulse of dread. But this time it was tempered by an odd calm. She knew her permits were in order. The pool had been legal, and filling it was not a violation of any covenant she had signed. Still, she prepared meticulously, organizing every receipt, every blueprint, every inspection report into neat binders that she stacked like fortifications around her. If Karen wanted to escalate to bureaucracy, Rachel would meet her there, not as a victim, but as a professional who knew how to speak the language of regulations. The hearing before the association board was scheduled for a Wednesday evening, held in a low beige building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old carpet. Rachel arrived early, her binders clutched tightly, and sat alone at the long table as members trickled in. Karen entered last, her stride brisk, her face composed in an expression of righteous indignation. She carried nothing but a small folder, yet her confidence filled the room as if she needed no evidence at all. When the meeting began, Karen spoke first, her voice sweet but dripping with scorn as she described Rachel's reckless transformation of the pool into an unsanctioned sand pit that threatened property values and community standards. She gestured with elegant disdain, painting Rachel as an irresponsible newcomer who disregarded the rules that bound everyone else. The board listened politely, nodding at intervals, though Rachel noticed the faint boredom in their eyes, the fatigue of people who had likely endured Karen's tirades many times before. When her turn came, Rachel stood and opened her binders with slow precision, laying out permits stamped with official seals, contracts signed and notarized, photographs of the construction taken at each stage, and even letters of approval from the county inspector. Her voice did not waver as she explained the legality of her actions, the safety of the design, the absence of any covenant prohibiting her choice. She concluded by saying, "This is my home. I have the right to shape it within the law, and I have done so carefully and responsibly. What I refuse to accept is harassment disguised as concern." The room was silent for a beat, and then one of the board members, an older man with tired eyes, leaned back and said simply, "The documentation is clear. There is no violation here." Karen's face tightened, her lips drawn into a thin line, but she did not speak further. The board moved on to other matters, and Rachel gathered her binders with steady hands, though her heart thundered inside her chest. She had won, at least for now, not through confrontation but through proof and patience, and the quiet satisfaction of that victory was more potent than any anger she had felt before. As she walked past Karen on her way out, the woman whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "This isn't finished." The words were not shouted, not dramatic, but heavy with promise, and Rachel knew they were true. That night she returned to her private beach, lit the fire pit, and sat in the glow while the neighborhood around her settled into silence. She felt both triumphant and weary, aware that Karen's obsession would not end with one failed complaint, yet also certain that she had crossed a threshold. No longer was she reacting blindly to attacks. She was choosing her ground, shaping her defenses, and forcing Karen to expose herself more and more as the aggressor. The midpoint of their struggle had been reached, and though Rachel could not predict what shape the next escalation would take, she felt an unfamiliar steadiness inside her, as if the sand beneath her feet was not just a replacement for the water, but a foundation on which she could stand, unshaken, against whatever storm was coming. For a brief time after the board dismissed Karen's complaint, Rachel allowed herself to believe that the tide had turned, that the evidence of her patience and diligence had silenced the campaign against her. Yet she should have known that, for someone like Karen, humiliation was not an end, but a catalyst. The quiet that followed the hearing was brittle, the kind of silence that precedes a storm, and Rachel felt it in the way neighbors glanced between them with nervous eyes, in the way Karen's curtain seemed always to twitch when Rachel stepped outside. The woman had been wounded in public, Her authority chipped, and such a loss could not be borne without retaliation. The retaliation began not with open confrontation, but with subtler weapons, the kind that seeped into daily life like a slow poison. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, unsigned but unmistakably hers, warning of sanitary hazards and insect infestations, supposedly caused by the sand. At first, Rachel tried to ignore them, but soon she noticed the shift in atmosphere. Neighbors who had once offered polite greetings now hesitated, their smiles faltering, their conversations shortened. The damage was not in the absurd accusations themselves, but in the doubt they planted, the suggestion that perhaps Rachel's sanctuary was a selfish indulgence at the expense of community well-being. One evening, as she returned from work, she found Karen at the curb speaking animatedly with an older couple, her gestures sharp as she pointed toward Rachel's yard. Their faces wore the strained expression of people too polite to disagree but too afraid to challenge. And when Rachel's car pulled into the driveway, Karen smiled triumphantly as if to announce that the jury had already been swayed. Rachel forced herself not to respond, though the bitterness of isolation gnawed at her. The sense of being surrounded by whispers, of being judged by glances she could not confront, was more corrosive than any direct insult. Then came the physical acts. One morning, Rachel discovered long drag marks across the sand, as though someone had raked through it deliberately to spoil the smooth surface. Another time, she found the fire pit filled with damp leaves and broken bottles. The gate latch was scratched, bearing fresh dents where tools had forced it open, though nothing was stolen. These violations were not about damage, but about presence, about reminding Rachel that her control was tenuous. She began to sleep lightly, waking at the smallest sound, straining her ears against the quiet to catch the scrape of shoes or the creak of wood. Some nights she would stand at the window for long minutes, staring into the shadows, half expecting to see Karen's face illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp. Still, Rachel refused to yield. She restored the sand each time, rebuilt the fire pit, locked the gate more securely. Yet the escalation continued, and the pressure mounted. Letters began arriving from the association again, this time not from the board, but from individuals claiming to represent community concern. They cited everything from drainage issues to potential lawsuits, their tone more aggressive than official, and Rachel realized that Karen was enlisting others to her cause, weaving a web of intimidation through borrowed voices. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon when Rachel returned home early and heard the unmistakable sound of laughter from her yard. She dropped her bag and rushed through the house, flinging open the back door, and froze at the sight before her. A group of children, none of whom she recognized, were tumbling in the sand as though it were a public playground, their shoes kicking up dust, while Karen sat smugly on the pergola bench, watching like a matriarch presiding over her domain. Rachel's voice cracked with fury as she demanded to know what was happening, and Karen responded with the kind of calm that only deep contempt could produce. "They needed somewhere safe to play," she said, "and you've turned your property into a spectacle. If you didn't want attention, perhaps you should have thought twice." Rachel's hands trembled as she shouted that this was trespassing, that she would call the police. But Karen stood slowly, gathering her things with deliberate grace. "Do that," she said softly. "Explain to the police why children playing in the sand is such a threat to you. Let's see how that looks." With that she left, shepherding the children out as if she were their protector, and Rachel their oppressor. Rachel remained standing in the yard, her chest heaving, the absurdity of the situation sinking like a stone. She realized that Karen had escalated beyond harassment into a campaign of spectacle, manipulating appearances so that Rachel seemed the villain for defending her own property. That night, Rachel sat alone at the edge of the fire pit, staring into the flames until her eyes burned, and understood with grim clarity that she was no longer fighting to preserve a backyard or even her peace, but to protect the legitimacy of her very presence in the neighborhood. Karen had twisted perception itself into a weapon, turning community against her, and if Rachel faltered even once, the story would harden into truth that she was the unstable one, the unfriendly neighbor, the source of discord. The escalation had reached a new stage, not of garbage or vandalism, but of narrative. And Rachel felt the crushing weight of knowing that she was now fighting for how she would be remembered, not just in this conflict, but in the eyes of everyone who lived on Hawthorne Lane. Rachel had thought she understood the rhythm of Karen's cruelty, the way it rose and fell in waves of harassment, but nothing prepared her for the night when the conflict erupted into something so brazen that it stripped away the last illusions of safety. It was late, the air thick with the heaviness of summer heat that refused to dissipate, and Rachel sat at her drafting table sketching lines for a new project, trying to lose herself in the precision of angles and measurements. Then she heard the crunch of gravel outside, sharp and deliberate. Not the careless tread of a passerby, but the heavy certainty of people who knew they did not belong. She froze, listening, the pencil slipping from her fingers, and then came the unmistakable sound of laughter. Low, mocking, unmistakably Karen's. She rose and crossed to the window, heart pounding, and what she saw sent a jolt through her veins. Figures in her yard, moving quickly, carrying bags of trash that they dumped across the sand in ugly heaps. Broken furniture, black garbage bags split open to reveal sour-smelling waste, scraps of food, and rusted cans, all hurled onto the private beach she had built with such care. At the center of it stood Karen, her arms folded, watching like a conductor overseeing a grotesque performance. Rachel's chest tightened as fury and disbelief collided, and without thinking she rushed outside, the screen door slamming behind her. Her voice tore through the night as she demanded they leave, but Karen only tilted her head, her eyes glinting with something close to triumph. "This is what happens," she said, her voice low and steady, "when someone refuses to listen. You think this street belongs to you, but it doesn't. It never did." The men with her, two younger neighbors she barely recognized, shifted uncomfortably, their courage clearly borrowed from Karen's dominance, yet they did not stop until Rachel stepped fully onto the sand, her fists clenched, her fury vibrating in every word. "You've crossed the line," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "This is vandalism. This is criminal." Karen smiled faintly, the kind of smile that stripped power from words, and said, "Then call the police. Tell them your neighbors stood in your yard. Let them decide who belongs here." Rachel's body trembled, but she did something she had not done before. She bent down and began pulling at the garbage, tearing open the bags, searching with frantic precision. And then she found it. An envelope with Karen's name printed on it in bold type, an address label intact, smeared but legible. She held it aloft, her hand shaking, her eyes locked on Karen's, and for the first time she saw the faint crack in the woman's composure. The smile faltered, the mask slipped, and silence hung heavy over the yard. The men muttered excuses and drifted away, leaving Karen standing alone amid the wreckage she had orchestrated. Rachel did not need to scream further. The evidence in her hand spoke louder than fury ever could. She whispered almost to herself, but loud enough to carry, "You did this." And now everyone will know Karen's face hardened into a mask of rage, but the performance had collapsed, the triumph gone. Without another word she turned and walked into the night, her footsteps sharp against the pavement until they disappeared. Rachel remained in the yard long after, the garbage around her reeking in the humid air, the sand defiled but her resolve sharper than it had ever been. She knew the battle was not over, but the climax had arrived, the moment when Karen's power cracked under the weight of her own arrogance. For months, Rachel had been painted as the unstable one, the selfish newcomer, but now she held proof in her hand, tangible and undeniable, that the harassment was real and malicious. She stood in the dim light, her hair damp with sweat, her chest rising and falling, and felt not victory exactly, but the fierce steadiness of someone who had endured the worst and remained standing. The morning after the confrontation, Rachel woke to a silence that felt different from the tense quiet of the past months, less like a trap waiting to spring, and more like the exhausted lull after a storm has broken itself against the shore. She stepped outside, the sun casting long pale beams across the sand, and surveyed the wreckage with eyes that were no longer full of despair, but of certainty. The garbage remained, sour-smelling and invasive, but the single envelope bearing Karen's name lay on top like a crown of proof, undeniable in its simplicity. She gathered the debris slowly, methodically, not out of defeat but as a deliberate act of reclamation, each piece of trash removed like a stone lifted from her chest. By the time the sand lay bare again, she felt a strange calm, the kind that follows when fear has been stripped away and replaced with resolve. Word of the night's events traveled faster than she could have imagined. By evening, neighbors who had once averted their eyes now approached with awkward sympathy, some offering cautious words, others bringing small gestures of support, a bottle of wine left on her porch, a card slipped into her mailbox. It was clear they had known of Karen's behavior all along but had been too frightened to speak until someone else forced the truth into daylight. Rachel did not revel in their change of heart, but she accepted it with the dignity of someone who no longer needed validation. When she saw Karen again, days later, the woman's shoulders seemed smaller, her gait less commanding, and though her eyes still burned with silent rage, her empire of fear had crumbled. Rachel returned to her private beach often in the weeks that followed, not as a fortress to defend, but as a sanctuary reclaimed, a place where she could sit by the fire pit as the dusk settled and feel the rare satisfaction of having endured. The neighborhood might never be the perfect refuge she once imagined, yet it had become something more valuable. A stage on which she had proven to herself that she could withstand malice, reshape destruction into creation, and stand unbroken in the face of relentless hostility. And as the wind rippled across the sand, carrying with it only the sound of leaves and not of laughter, she knew that this was the true resolution, not the defeat of Karen, but the quiet, unshakable certainty that her home and her life belonged to her, alone.